Men obstructed from entering female-dominated occupations. Oh my God, you guys, we did it. Sexism against women is over. The feminists have upended patriarchy and instituted matriarchy. That's right. You thought we wanted equality, but what we really wanted was more. More! Okay, no. Let's dig into a few facts before we start on this. Number one, regardless of this study's results, I have absolutely no doubt that some, if not most, men are regularly discriminated against in some, if not most, female-dominated industries. Number two, there are many ways to discriminate against a person, even just within their career. This study looked at exactly one of those ways. Number three, the study was done in Sweden, which, according to the World Economic Forum, is ranked fourth in the world for gender equality, just above Nicaragua? Really? Oh, okay. That's like a whole other video. I'm fascinated by that. I'm going to look into that later. Let's put a pin in that. But I mentioned the Sweden thing because we live in a US-centric society, especially those of us who live in the United States. And so we tend to assume that every study is about us. For context, though, while Sweden was the fourth best in gender equality, the WEF ranked the United States 53rd, just ahead of Singapore? Really? We beat Singapore? Damn, y'all, I have a lot of internal biases about various countries' gender equality issues that I need to examine. Again, not for this video. Okay, so this study was just published in PLOS One, and it looked at pre-existing data from 3 previous studies, all of which include the same main author as this new study, that together submitted more than 3,200 fake job applications from fake men and women to real employers in 15 different industries, some of which were female-dominated, some of which were male-dominated. They found that male-dominated industries were just as positive about female applicants as they were about male applicants. But female-dominated industries were significantly more positive about female applicants than they were about male applicants. Interesting. But let's go back to one of my earlier points. There are many ways to discriminate against a person in their career. You can tell a child, for instance, that they are not suited to do a particular job because of their gender or race or sexuality. You can grade that child more harshly. You can steer them toward different college majors. You can put them in a major that is dominated by people who are all one gender or race or ethnicity or sexuality that they do not share, and therefore they do not feel comfortable there or like they belong there. You can treat them poorly in class. You can reject their job application. You can give them a harder interview. You can not hire them. You can hire them, but then treat them like shit. You can pay them less. You can give them fewer perks, less vacation time. And you can fire them for something that you wouldn't necessarily fire someone of a different gender or race or ethnicity or sexuality. This study looked specifically at one of those. You can reject their job application. This study did not show that women were just as likely as men to be hired in male-dominated industries, only that they were just as likely to be invited in for an interview when they submit their application. Which is still something. You know, a seat at the table is one important step. And it is unconscionable if Swedish men aren't being offered the same opportunities in female-dominated industries. But does this study prove that that's happening? Well, it's a bit more complicated than you may think. Because 1/3 of this study's data came from a study on how convicted criminals fare in a job search. Not just men versus women, but men who were convicted of an assault and are currently doing community service because of that, versus women who were convicted of an assault and are currently doing community service because of it. We already have a more complicated problem to deal with. People might be more likely to view a man convicted of assault as being more violent than a woman who is convicted of assault. And that prejudice may have basis in reality, considering that, at least here in the United States, about half of all assaults committed by men are simple assaults, which is the least serious charge, compared to 75% of all women who are convicted of assaults. Now add to that the fact that the female-dominated industries these ex-convicts applied to included preschool teacher, and the male-dominated industries included truck driver. Gosh, I wonder which one would be more likely to discriminate against a man accused of assault. And to be clear, that study about ex-convicts in the hiring process, I think is quite good. The problem happens when they follow up with this new paper that strips the data of all context and then uses it to come to conclusions that aren't necessarily warranted. In the original study, they also looked at how gender affected the applicants, only instead of just saying men versus women, in male-dominated versus female-dominated industries, they also broke it down based on whether or not a job was high skill or low skill. While they did find that, and I quote, female ex-offenders face unequal treatment in the hiring process just as male ex-offenders do, they also found that discrimination against ex-offenders was most prominent in female-dominated and high-skilled occupations, supporting our conjectures that we derived based on the contact hypothesis. We argued that since criminals are more likely to be men and less educated, the probability of coming into contact with ex-offenders would be higher in a male-dominated population and among low-skilled groups. We therefore conjectured that employers in male-dominated and low-skilled occupations would be more familiar and have higher acceptance towards ex-offenders. In fact, our results showed that ex-offenders were not discriminated against in any of the male-dominated low-skilled occupations included in our study, i.e. auto mechanic and truck driver. Boom! Context. It doesn't make for a great headline, but it does help us understand a complicated problem a little bit better. So that was a full 1/3 of the data used in this new study. Another third came from a study that looked at victims of crime, which was also evaluated in the original study in view of gender and also had more context in that it also looked at high skill versus low skill jobs. They found that female victims were discriminated against in both female and male-dominated fields, regardless of skill level, while male victims were discriminated against more in specifically female-dominated high-skill positions. The last study, the last third of that data, came from a study on transgender candidates in which they discarded the transgender candidates and kept the control group. That's literally the only data set that should really be considered here. They aren't ex-convicts, they aren't crime victims, they're just people who aren't volunteering uncomfortable things about themselves to potential employers in their introductory emails. Like, hey, I'd love to be your new preschool teacher. By the way, I did assault someone last year, but that is ancient history. Anyway, I had a 3.4 GPA. It's funny because all of these studies share an author, so I'm not trying to say that Ali Ahmed of Linköping University is a bad researcher. But I am suggesting that maybe this is one of those cases where publish or perish has a real negative impact on the quality of research that ends up making headlines, getting published and then going on to make headlines. By pressuring scientists to constantly publish new research or get fired, we encourage them to do things like this. Go back to your own data, shuffle it around, drop context, and see if you can come up with something statistically significant to support a new hypothesis, in order to buy yourself another year or so of not getting hassled to publish. All of this is not to say that researchers shouldn't use existing data sets. That happens all of the time, but it needs to be done very carefully with hypotheses and statistical models that are pre-registered. So we know that the scientists aren't just using data they're very familiar with already to cherry pick it in order to suit a new purpose. And again, just to reiterate, I do not doubt that there's discrimination against men in female-dominated industries. But if we want to fix that, we need better studies to understand exactly why that's happening, the extent of the problem, so that we can form better policies that will lead to true equality in the workplace.